Hello. The last decade has produced more sustainability infrastructure than the previous three combined. Had regulations, reporting frameworks, net zero commitments, ESG teams, and chief sustainability officers in boardrooms across the world. Then we got a spate of market shocks, compounding energy crises, feckless war spending, and a general political climate that has other priorities. The floor fell out from under our feet faster than any of us in the space could have foreseen. And now you throw into that mix AI, which has arrived asking big existentialist questions of its own. And also with the genuine potential to do what legislation couldn't. So, reinventing in real time the very industrial processes which created the problem in the first place. Having said that, the sustainability function is conspicuously losing its seat at the C suite table. So now, instead of being a planetary health story, this has become focused on incentives and institutions and what happens when the very people with the vital expertise are no longer in the room where these earthly decisions get made. Welcome back to Tech Tuesdays, where we take an alternative look at market dynamics through our own lens. I'm Niladri Roy. I have a decade in energy and climate tech and also a background in energy and environmental economics. So I have seen sustainability move from an abstract conversation to where the revenue is, to where the investor risk sits, and now increasingly where the geopolitical considerations land. So I'm especially excited today because I'm joined by someone who has spent most of his career, which is a significantly longer span of time, inside the space. He has truly seen the creative ambitions of the sustainability movement bloom, and then the institutional reality of trying to hold that agenda together without the formal authority to do so. And also equally, by a CTO and a founder who has persistently kept asking the very pointed question of whether there is even any commercial logic holding at all and how technology can change that, both AI and otherwise. So, why don't we start with some introductions? Wouter, over to you.
Thanks very much, Niladri. And yeah, this is going to be a great conversation, I think, because you set it up beautifully. I'm excited to join you today. Yeah, excited to be joined also by Jamil. And Jamil, I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks, Sofa. It's Jamil, career CTO. Very excited to be here, but most of the time, all we do is technology, 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 which turns out a lot of energy. The role that you do is quite vital, and obviously the outcome is quite important as well. So looking forward to our chat.
Lovely. So, I think where we could start off with is what we could loosely call the arc of sustainability. So, as we have discussed beforehand, a lot of people are looking at what appears to be the declining CSO, Chief Sustainability Officer headcount, and they're concluding that sustainability is in decline or retreat. And although that might seem so on the surface, maybe that isn't entirely the right read because we've had 20 plus years of evolving the reputation, the strategy, and thankfully increasingly the operations. So it maybe it's when sustainability is succeeding, it just becomes BAU. But I think far better to comment on that and with a full span of the history. Wouter, why don't we go right back to the roots? And it's something that you raised prior that if the original movement had led with opportunity rather than catastrophe, where might we be today, all things being equal?
Yeah, well, let's go back to sustainability even before I got involved in it in a corporate context. So it was really environmentalists who saw that something had to be done. There were various environmental issues, and they said, "Look, we have to do something about this." And they were really looking at corporations to change their ways. Somebody once said that they were selling a nightmare rather than a dream, and that maybe something went wrong there. because people respond better to a dream, generally speaking, than to nightmares. Um, what happened at that point is that there was health and safety, and environment was added to it. So you had environment, health, and safety. And then gradually, reputation became more involved. And not all companies, by the way, responded in this at the same speed, right? Some changed really quickly, and others are still laggards in that respect. But essentially, what happened was then a phase that was focused on reputation, and you could call in back in you could call it greenwashing looking back, but there was some concern about let's at least communicate what we are doing, even though maybe the claims were a bit like what we would call greenwashing now. Then came a whole 10 years or so after that, where the focus was more on strategy. So this was the time that companies would make big commitments, and it was truly like a board topic. You know, what is our climate commitment? What is our water commitment, our waste commitment, etc. But climate in particular. And there was a lot of work involved in that. And what we've now come to is that most companies of a certain size have those commitments, but how do you now actually execute that in your operations? How do you really deliver on your promises? Now, at the same time, of course, you have the situation in the US, which is not really pro sustainability. You have the EU, which is distracted with war, with competitiveness, etc. And corporations, well, by and large, I would say, are maybe not emphasizing the role of the CSO anymore, but they are looking still at how do we operationalize, how do we deliver on our promises and make the changes. And that's not just because this is the right thing to do for the environment or we're going to save the world together. This is often because renewable energy is the cheapest energy in many cases. It is because, reducing waste is good operational practice. So that's, I think, where we are today.
It's quite interesting how you put it. And I think the biggest gap is probably education. I think it's initially when the whole sustainability concept came sort of to the mainstream, I think most people were confused of what is it, right? So it was about educating people. That was the first step, and I think we're kind of getting there. I don't think everyone's got it, but we're definitely getting there. And once you understand it, the next question is, from my perspective as a company, how does it impact me, or how am I impacting that environment? And I think it took a while. It took a while, and also we probably didn't give it the kind of importance that it deserves. And we'll discuss a little bit more later in terms of what it should look like, or then and now. But it does remind me a little bit of the trajectory of the sort of the cyber side of business, right? So when we went into tech, we were just piling on tech, it's fantastic, but we didn't understand the sort of exposure that this tech is bringing, especially with the open internet. Having your own tech in your own building, not connected to the outside world, easy. Once it's connected to the outside world, it's another story. And then it wasn't that important, and there wasn't no such role as a CSI, a CISO, for example. But once attacks occurred, vulnerabilities became obvious and far-reaching, including reputational damage and financial damage. Suddenly, we took notice of this kind of practice, and it elevated from being within the IT space to being a C-suite member on its own, that has a significant budget to actually do. And our view, looking at it, is no longer as so heavy tech. It's literally like bank robbers. We're stopping them from robbing us, right? That's what it's about. And we understand that. Whereas sustainability had another problem, which is the tangibility of it. I think it wasn't tangible for most people. It was more, pie in the sky, or the environmentalist kind of thing, but we don't see its impact or its effects. So I think it went through a journey, it's still going through a journey,
Just
and I think
add,
it's got
having
another
seen the
more
energy
to go.
side of things very directly, and we talked about renewables, it didn't really win on conscience as much as we like to think that. It was really the economics, and it was the two together. There was a will, but until there was that economic tipping point, for want of a better term, then it couldn't really progress. But you've both raised some interesting things, and I think that cyber one is really interesting. We'll put a pin in that because I think we can come back to that one later. And I think from a point that Wouter made, a jumping off point, if we consider how it has been framed to date, and one of, I guess, at the pan-governmental level, the pioneer was the EU, for better or for worse, and it did very much try to just do a big bang type approach, and it was further along the timeline, and we had the Green Deal, which is very much a deliberate attempt to create some irreversible regulatory momentum. And then, of course, we got hit with the things we talked about. We had a decade of economic squeeze, energy crisis, war spending, all of that mishmash of things. But the compliance frameworks and the standards have still endured over that time. So, Jamil, I'm actually going to put it to you because you drew already a parallel with cyber and its tech. And there are parallels between sustainability and tech regulation as well, especially in terms of the balance between compliance and innovation. So maybe we could start with your thoughts on what you've seen as the regional EU or even beyond approach, and whether you think it was visionary or just set up to fail from the start.
I'm not so strong on knowledge of the EU side of it. I'll give you some example from a tech perspective of what's happened in the past. Some of us may not remember something called ROHS, which basically was printed circuit boards, and basically they were using chemicals which were not good for the planet, and that water went into systems and so on. I would say about sort of the early 2000s, a rule came along, and basically we in the European world will not accept technical goods without that ROHS stamp on it, and something called WEE, which was basically the recycling side of it. So one is about the chemical, one is about the actual recycling of it. So that is part of sustainability. And that was, good 20-something years ago in terms of my experience. But that's a different industry, right? But somebody was thinking about sustainability, but it was ad hoc. It was for that specific industry and so on. So where we're at today in terms of sustainability is more of a global view, a local view, and a transition view. So the global view is, the forever chemicals or whatever may be at manufacturing level. And the local view in terms of, or I say regional views in terms of, how does the EU see sustainability, and how does that trickle down to a corporate level and not manufacturing? Because manufacturing is a very different space, and they have an even more complicated layer of sustainability, I would assume, with chemicals and stuff like that. But I think from the EU's perspective, it has taken several steps, demanding that stuff coming, tech stuff and stuff coming from China would have ROHS compliance. And later on was the WEE sort of protocol, which was all about, the recycling and repackaging and the clean destruction of it, or disposing of it, I think. So that was basically in the late 2000s. So there is an effort. It's going in the right direction. It's gone at different speeds in different businesses, different segments of the business world, as well as the different segments of the world as well. And where we're at today is slightly different as well. So I think Wouter will be able to give us a better picture on that, and more specific from a corporate space.
Yeah,
I
and
think
it's good
go on then,
because we
Niladri.
started at that macro level. Now, Wouter, you can probably dive in a bit more about some of the specifics.
Yeah, there was a particular EU Commission, the one before the current one, that was elected with a lot of green votes, and they were extremely ambitious. And basically, the centerpiece was this the Green Deal. It was an umbrella of a host of regulations that were all aimed at making Europe the absolute forefront of sustainability and taking the rest of the world with it, because it was not just about the EU, but also about all the supply chains, the global supply chains that feed the products in the EU. And it was so overwhelming. The amount of regulation was so overwhelming that Okay, I don't have a special insight into how the EU works, but I tell you, it felt like it was by design that it was overwhelming, so that any company couldn't just put all their lobbying efforts on a particular piece of legislation. It was just full frontal, all regulations that you could think of were suddenly hitting you. Just give you an example, EUDR, the EU deforestation regulation, has massive impact on a load of companies. And when I first had to explain the EUDR to some of my colleagues, they nearly fell off their chairs. I mean, it was so far-ranging and it was so global and it had so much work involved and so much cost involved to do the tracking of these supply chains that people just thought this is just like it's going too far for the kind of benefit it's trying to reach. Now, what the EU was trying to do, I think, was to take sustainability from some good intentions and some nice words to something that was really uh, uh, set in stone in supply chains and that was really linked to the financial markets as well. So there was transparency. And that is why this whole reporting legislation came about as well. So there's now a huge amount of reporting that you need to do. So instead of putting all your efforts as a sustainability function uh, into actually creating impact and making your company, more energy efficient and so forth, you have to put a huge amount of effort into your reporting, not just the external reporting that you need to do, but actually answering the questions from your customers who come back and say, so tell me about, are you EUDR compliant? Tell me how much each of my orders, how much CO2 is involved with that. I want to know all that detail, huge amounts of data, and everybody has a different template on how to do it. It's overwhelming, I'll tell you. So I think what the EU did rightly or wrongly, is to create a compliance industry that delighted the big accountancy firms, no doubt. It did not delight sustainability functions for sure, and it didn't create a lot of impact, in my view, in terms of positive impact on sustainability. What is now interesting is that AI is coming in, and I think AI is going to actually take care of the reporting side with some ease and free up some space to actually not focus on the reporting, which is the least interesting part of AI as an application, sustainability application, and instead focus on how can we completely reinvent some of these business processes, which is where actually the environmental impact sits. So for me, I know that AI has its pros and its cons, but for me, that's the exciting bit. AI is coming regardless. And that for me is a chance of moving away from all that reporting and all that heavy data heavy stuff that can be taken care of. We now need to look at the business processes that create the impact in the first place and focus there.
But do you think the commission shoot themselves in the foot by creating this sort of overwhelming avalanche of regulation and paperwork or whatever it is to achieve a goal, and that goal is maybe too big to do in a specific time frame, and there's no clear smaller steps. I mean, we can see the goal, let's say 2045, for example. But if we achieve this by 2030, we could go on to the next part and to the next part. But also, I find it difficult to understand where is the reward in all this. All it just seems to be is that I'm going to make your life more complex. I'm going to make your life more demanding for reporting and so on. And then I'm going to make your life even more difficult by the fact that you have to go and change your systems, processes, and so forth. But yet I don't see any, the carrot side of it, right? Other than you'll
Yeah,
live longer and the planet will be happier and all that kind of stuff, which is also obviously important. And I think that would be a discussion a little bit further
yeah,
in our chat today. But the thing is, are they going about it the wrong way? Are they going, we tried the scare tactics, right? If you don't do this, the planet is going to blow up. And that kind of worked to a certain extent for the cyber world, right? But there's also a point where you say, you know what? let it happen. There is a cost. We'll work out what that is, or we'll insure for that, or we'll cover it, or we'll provision for it. But that whole big bang, huge amount, and that's just in one small segment in, say, forestry, for an example, just makes it difficult for people to buy into, to support.
Yeah, gosh, yeah, bang on, man, Jamil. I got the feeling, and again, I don't have a beautiful insight into the inner workings of the European Commission, but from the conversations I heard from people who were involved directly or indirectly, I got the feeling that the Commission doesn't necessarily understand all the realities of how business actually works, how these processes actually work. But they do know that if they put in something really ambitious, that business has to adjust and has to innovate. And I think there was a certain amount of fingers crossed. Let's put something really ambitious in place, like maybe California would have done in the US, for car emissions or something. And that by design, it automatically sort of, if you want to sell a car in California, you need to meet those emissions regulations, right? So maybe they thought we're the California of the world. We're just going to do this amazing ambitious regulation, and innovation will do the rest. And I just think that that was naive, and I think it was overreach to some extent. And then, guess what? The next European Commission had to deal with war, had to deal with energy crisis, and had to deal with competitiveness of Europe. And suddenly, to come back to the example I used about the EU deforestation regulation, you now see that that is being reduced and delayed and reduced and delayed step by step. And by the way, every time at the last minute, which makes it incredibly hard to manage as a company because you want to be ready months in advance. And if it keeps changing, the bar gets lowered all the time. You don't know what you're aiming for anymore. And each time it's at the last minute. I find it's not a very efficient way of getting business to come with you. Let's put it that way.
Sure, but look, I mean, the example you gave, which is a great example, the emissions in the US, but that's one specific industry and one specific product within that, right? It wasn't 200 things, right, that they all had to deal with.
Mm.
Okay, they came up with silly bumpers, their car bumpers were bigger, but the point is, it was one thing. So the supply chain of consumer petrol is easy to manage, and then the builders of engines and carburetors and so on could manage that somehow, and there was a certain timeline, and that made a huge impact. So it's like it was one thing that they fixed, and it had an 80% increase, decrease in carbon monoxide in the streets or whatever it may be. With this, there's just so much going on that basically businesses will just shut down, saying, you know what, I'm gonna just put aside. But I think that hasn't helped, which is kind of our topic today. That hasn't helped the importance of the chief sustainability officer. So I think that's a bit we should really cover a little bit more on, because I'll give it back to Niladri on that one.
Yeah, nice segue, Jamil. And I think actually what you two
Thinking
just
about headback,
discussed there
yeah.
does, yeah, that's good. But it does raise quite an important point, which is relevant here, which is where should influence it? How do you even package up that influence? Because like so many things, CSO function, the CSO individual themselves, they have to have some influence on capital allocation, like any function within a business. And what we've been seeing is that CSO seems to be disappearing from exec teams, being absorbed into finance or corporate affairs or something else. But as we tried to do earlier, which we're reframing what seems like a bad situation, it's worth considering that maybe that is a positive sign because sustainability is indeed influencing a wider variety of the important decisions that are being made. As you mentioned, supply chains, I would add to that things like factory upgrades, things like that, right? These are very much being done with sustainability rather than just efficiency in mind. But even having said that, who's inheriting the accountability? Where are the sustainability outcomes being measured? If I were to take a very crude example, it doesn't seem to be reflected in bonus structures or anything like that. So, Wouter, you're going to be absolutely best placed to comment. If CSO is disappearing from the C-suite, then what happens with that accountability for sustainability outcomes? And let's put aside things like bonuses. What happens to this thing that seems to be floating?
Yeah, no, I've been a CSO in a few companies, and in some companies, sustainability is in the bonus structure, and so uh, that is something that is definitely the case. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the CSO is in the right place in the board. So the question that you asked was, should the CSO be on the board? Is that something that that we should be mourning that they've been disappearing? Now, there's two things I want to mention. One is that you said um, and Jamil actually said it's about education, and I want to go back to that. So the question for me is, has the CSO had enough time to now educate everybody on the exec team and everybody in the board so that they can make those decisions about capital allocation? If so, then the CSO has done his job and sustainability can just be dispersed into the organization. And for a long time, the chat in the sustainability world has been about sustainability should be not a central function, it should be integrated in the company. And you can see that happening now. And it's gone, like I said in the beginning, it's gone from reputation to strategy and now into operations. It's all about integrating it into the business. And I've seen that, for example, once you put sustainability people into the finance function, wow, then you can see the cross contamination of their skill sets, of their knowledge, and suddenly you can see the effects of that, the positive effects of that, and you can see that in sales, you can see that in all kinds of parts of the organization, certainly in operations. As a CSO, of course, I'd like to be on the executive team of, you know, because then you're at the table when the big decisions are being made. We're going to acquire a competitor, or we're going to build a greenfield factory somewhere. You want to be there to influence it. But the reality, I think, that we're seeing now is that faced with the extra complexity and cost of having sustainability sort of force fit into that executive team versus just the standard organizational structure, the standard functions, it is easy for a CEO to say, listen, I think we've got it now. We are accountable. My people in the executive team are accountable. They know what they're doing when it comes to sustainability. We're just going to do it. And yes, there will be some sustainability specialists, but they will sit somewhere else, anywhere else in the organization. And each part of the organization, each function, each business unit has some sustainability knowledge. Even if that is not a dedicated person, we'll make sure that it's there. I kind of get it. I kind of get it. And although personally, I would like it to be a little bit different. I would say so. I'm a CSO. I also think that sustainability becomes successful when it's happening and it's not called sustainability anymore. It's just good business. That's ultimately where all this started. People wanted business to change its normal ways. And, arguably that is happening. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Well, if I could just add two things, I just think that the most important part is that the role of sustainability is not disappearing. It's just moving either vertically, and horizontally. I think that's the kind of the important part that is still there. And the second important point that you fully covered in there is that integration of sustainability across the whole organization. If it's just one group of people, it's different to when it's actually across the whole board. So everyone's accountable, everyone's responsible, everyone's part of their deliverable is there. So I think it had to be done where the CSOs were at the board level to get that top-down message across and educate people. And I think the role is not going to disappear. It's just going to shift in a different format. And it could be an external thing, could be vertical, horizontal change, but it does depend on the industry it's at.
All right. So if we're saying that sustainability is just being diffused across the organization, whether it's centralized or otherwise, still needs to be paid for, or it still needs to show business results. So if we now go back to that cyber analogy, Jamil, that you had from earlier on, that also had to make financial sense. So if we go back, I don't know, 15 years, 20 years, whatever it might be, there was a push for a preemptive investment for something that seemed like an abstract threat, and ROI was in question. But then you had your denial of service attacks and your ransomware attacks and all of that, and all of a sudden the cost of inaction really got quantified in a big way. So I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are, both of you, on what it would now take. We're getting there, but what would be the additional steps required in a business context for sustainability risk to be treated in the same way and with the same urgency as cyber risk? So actually, I'm going to start with Jamil, because you're the one that seeded the idea earlier on.
I'm glad you started with me, because I have less to state on this than Wouter, but I think retrofitting sustainability is much more costlier than to actually have it built in right from the start. So that would be my view on it, is that if it was thought of right at the beginning and it's part of the whole build of whatever it is that I'm building and so on, then it's a lot easier and lower cost to ensure sustainability in my proposition, and I can utilize the sustainability card right early on. So I think that's a very quick one for me.
And I would say when you look at sustainability, there's some actually more than expected. There are ROI cases that are fully within sort of most companies' limits, whether it is a 3-year payback or 4-year payback or whatever it might be. There are plenty of technologies that often companies don't know about because they've been doing things the way they've been doing it. And they know the technologies they know. So coming back to education, there is a point of sustainability professionals educating the right people in the organization about what technologies are available, what sort of solutions they might not have thought about. Okay, then you look at those and you look at them side by side and say which ones are the ones that have the right ROI, and you start there, because that is where the finance, your CFO can immediately say yes, and your CEO can say yes, because there's no downside. You just go for it and you get the payback. Yeah. The interesting bit is, how do you get to the items that really require longer payback, or if you look at scope 3 emissions, things that are outside of your immediate control, and that is harder. And obviously, there's been the speech, Mark Carney's speech about the tragedy of the horizon, and this is really true in the case of sustainability. Is that the effects of ignoring sustainability are long term, and they're slow for you to see. And I've just read today that El Nino is coming again, and we've just had more than 30 degrees in London, and it is that was still in May. So I'm just, those are things that people say, oh yeah, but it's about belief. Do you believe in climate change? And I just think, oh my God, seriously, are we still talking about that? It's not just about ROI. It's not just about technologies. It's also about change, psychology of change, and whether people are actually willing to change, and how quickly they can.
Yeah, I mean, again, is that whole psychological and mental change at a corporate level, right? It's important, and it needs to be consistent as well. I mean, it's not like you do it one quarter, you forget it another. It's got to be consistent and entrenched in your processes.
Yeah.
I'd like to add, because it's reminding me of doing energy econ. We had discount rates for carbon emissions, and you start putting it in those terms. Even I forget the name, but some very famous economists that said, oh well, we can put a discount rate on it, and there isn't the case to take action now, which, reflecting on it even at the time, seemed like a ludicrous thing to say. But until people are viscerally feeling something, as we've said with the heat waves. It's still this abstract concept. So unfortunately, we are now feeling that much more than we have in years gone by. So it's becoming a much more real and pressing matter for people. So which is ultimately a good thing, I would say. All right, and since it was mentioned, why don't we go on to everyone's favorite topic du jour, AI. And AI is getting a lot of the press, but there's been lots of tech in the recent years. I've come out of a climate tech space. There's been lots of good stuff, and AI has really been pushing that along. And as we've said, probably the most mundane, frankly dull version of it is helping with the reporting and compliance, although it's very, very necessary. So we've got two parallel tracks. We've got how AI is going to be helping the sustainability professional, whether the CSO or otherwise, and then also, I would say more importantly, how AI is helping with industrial processes, whether that's physical or software level. I think both very important in terms of things like waste reduction and lower carbon product design, and all of these things which are actually live and happening now rather than hypothetical. But either way, at least now we're thinking about the economics of the whole agenda rather than this abstract thing that's out there in the world. So, Jamil, you're our resident tech expert. So yeah.
Look,
give us whatever you're seeing.
It's a very, very important one, and data centers look at efficiency in general in quite detail, right? Now, environmental efficiency would be lumped in, more in more recent times. And look, I'm an advocate of sustainable business, which is good business in general, and it's for the future. And I think the interesting part for data centers is that they're one specific location, or they're not like in every corner of the street. They're concentrated in one space in a particular town. So it's quite a visible unit. It's quite tangible and visible. So if they are polluting water or if they're polluting the air, it's quite contained in that area, so therefore you can see it and spot it quite easily, and the public domain can react to that. So I think building those data centers without thinking of sustainability would be just crazy, suicidal. It just doesn't make sense, right? And it's so easy for them to do because they're building from scratch. And I said retrospective fitment is always more complex and more costly. And the fact that you're doing it from the beginning, and you've got environmental, you've got system, all these kind of things that you have in mind as part of your design aspect, should feature right at the beginning, and they should get it right. So no excuses in my point. It's no different to any data center that we've had in prior to the last 5 years. They're just a magnitude larger in terms of need for energy, right, and density and heat generation. So I think it's quite important that they do consider how much extra heat we're generating in the neighborhood, because you might end up impacting local climates. Who knows, right? You might create crazy tornadoes in Peckham. I don't know. I mean, it would be quite crazy, right? But if you had a data center in Peckham, for example. So they do impact in terms of heat, in terms of noise. In some cases, they have heard they've impacted water and so on. So the design right at the start should be done correct, which means including sustainable, environmental, community considerations.
You can really see already, if I take the Netherlands, my native Netherlands as an example, data centers have a real impact on the electricity network. In many places, the electricity network is full, as it's called, and people are having difficulty just, for example, selling their electricity from their solar panels to the grid because the grid is full. And then suddenly a big data center comes along and says, "Yep, give me that electricity," and they take up a huge amount of electricity that could otherwise be available for homes, that could otherwise be available for other businesses. So I think the social impact as well as the environmental impact of data centers is in some cases already quite visible.
But that's wild, right? I mean, that's really wild that you're actually giving priority for a data center rather than homes, right? So it's important that you would have your chat thing, right, in the evening than it is to light one's home. I mean, that's just wild that having that kind of priority corporate decision making.
Yeah, and it impacts on investments of other companies as well, because they might have to say no to certain things because they can't get the electricity that they need for their investment. But that's just one aspect of it.
I mean, that's quite an important aspect. I don't, you don't need to belittle it. It's like, it's either you have light at home or you don't have light at home because the other thing is taking it. It's crazy.
And that's visible, and people can feel that they can feel it even in their wallet if they suddenly the payback of their solar PV is not what it was supposed to be because there's a there's a data center suddenly in the neighborhood that fills up the net. I also think I'm still quite look any big technology, whether it is the internet or AI, it has its pros and its cons, and we've just talked about some of the cons. I'm also on the pro side. I'm hopeful that AI will have more impact on sustainability than 1,000 pages of regulation from the EU, because I'm just thinking, look, if I think about all these business processes that have been quite similar, I used to work in the paper industry, right? And so if you think about how paper making has stayed the same over the years, massive machines, but the basics of paper making have not changed, and you need a vast amount of heat to make paper. And I'm just quietly hopeful that AI will manage breakthroughs that we haven't been able to manage as humans with our old technologies. So it's those breakthroughs I would be looking for. Certainly reporting. I've spoken in the past to Niladri about, can we do something about reporting? Can we use AI to reduce the burden of reporting? Because there were so many people that had to work on reporting. It was just crazy in one of the teams that I worked in. I think that one will be solved relatively quickly. That's not the most interesting one. It is the reinvention of business processes that will hopefully have the big impact that we're looking for.
Just to add on to the environmental thing, it's the later part of the afternoon on the 2nd of June, and we've got torrential rain in London right now, right? It's just, in London we were used to bad weather, right? But this is another thing. You can't actually walk in this at all, right? This is the kind of thing that you would find in Washington, D.C. happening, right? So this is definitely the environment saying something back to us, right? But it's also, going to your point, cost, money is a driver, right? And if you look at your paper business way back then, who used a lot of water, as prices of water went up or electricity, whatever it is, they were forced to innovate, to find ways of creating from pulp to paper in a much more cost-effective way. And the same will apply for the data centers, in that today they're building for something, and that something is going to consume hopefully less energy by the time it comes on, because the chips will consume less but produce more compute, and so forth. But at the same time, I think our usage of AI will plateau in a specific way, but we're going to have a lot more people using it because still it hasn't penetrated everyone's lives yet. But hopefully it will plateau, and then we're going to be using less of that energy over time as the software gets smarter. The machines get more effective and more efficient, and the data center can maybe regenerate some of that stuff, and fourthly, it doesn't need to be in where we are in terms of residential areas. It could be somewhere completely unseen, out of way, out of sight, sort of thing. But that's just a view I hold.
And I would like to add, because we talked about the social impact of all of this technology, and as is my one, always trying to get some of the slightly geeky environmental economics in there. There's been a concept around for a long time, which is social cost of carbon. And I'd actually say it wasn't as relevant some years back. Of course, it had relevance, but it was a bit too abstract. But when we talk about, okay, what is the impact on the local community? If you can't even arbitrage your home-generated solar and your battery back onto the grid because it's just it's blocked, it's congested, that has knock-on effects. That's not just about the energy usage itself. That then has implications on what are the actual activities, sustenance activities happening within a community or a town or even a city. So some of the more interesting ways of factoring that in, I think, are going to become more prevalent as we go on. And some of these concepts which have been around in the field for a couple of decades are going to start finding their way onto the balance sheet in some form or another. That's my hypothesis about where things are going.
Yeah. I mean, cost is going to play a major role in it, right? And the cost is a deciding factor. In humanity, we tend to look at the cost rather than the existential risk of us not existing, right? We see that so far away, but the cost will, sort of impact behavior.
And the cost is not just the cost, like you say, Niladri, there's a social cost. It's not just an ROI cost, but it's also, what does my customer think? What does my investor think? Because there's a cost there as well of competitiveness, and that is, in my experience, very strong driver, customers and investors, and making sure you keep those on board. And if strategic customers ask you to do something, you do it. And so there is still power and cost in that as well.
All right. It's been really bumper, and we've got one more mini topic to cover, but it's just been really great stuff. So to round it all out, and if we do now look to the future of specifically the CSO role, Wouter, I think you're going to still be a CSO, but those coming down the track behind you, what do you see the sustainability professional of 2030 looking like? Because you've got this dual transition of the role itself and whether that spreads across an organization, and then whether that's actually good for planetary health itself. And those are two separate considerations that coalesce. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think companies have less need for somebody who can talk about the gospel of sustainability and do we believe in sustainability and all that. We don't need that. We need people who can really teach the whole organization, every part of the organization, how they can help the company to have less environmental impact and to make more money at the same time. And that is something that there's an art to that. And I can see in the companies that I've worked with that you can't just say companies get it or they don't get it. Some people in the company get it. Some people educate themselves or they don't. So some companies are laggards, some companies are leaders. Some of the leaders, in fact, have, if you look at Unilever and Danone, have actually stepped back from all their ambition and have basically decided that they've maybe have been too ambitious and were not able to deliver on everything and still be attractive to the financial markets. So I guess what I'm saying here is the sustainability professional of the future, whether they're called CSO or something else, still have the duty and the opportunity to ensure that everybody in the organization understands what they can do in their role in the company to lower environmental impact, make the company more efficient and more profitable, and look out for the people involved as well. And that is a complex thing because you have to look at issues from all these different angles, all these different departments, business units, and the external world as well. So sustainability remains inherently complex, which is what I find interesting about it. And that's why I think AI plays a role in that as well, to simplify the complexity. So that's where I see it. So the future CSO or the future sustainability professional must be commercially literate, preferably have lived in the real world in a commercial or operational role in the company, must know a lot about sustainability, and must be AI literate. Those are the three things that they must have.
All right. Really good stuff. That was a really bumper session, but unfortunately, as ever, I've not even come to the end of time. We've way shot over time, which I don't think is a bad thing at all because it's been really dense with good stuff. So if that's been useful and informative to you, our audience, then please do follow us at Tech Tuesdays. And of course, we will be back with more sessions in the near future in the series. And if you've got any topics that are of interest to you now, if you've picked out any of the threads from what we've discussed today, please drop them in the comments, and we will potentially even expand those into their own separate call sessions themselves. So all that remains for me to do is say thank you very much to both Wouter and Jamil for what I genuinely feel was a really very, very great, dense discussion of good stuff. And thank you very much for watching us. See you again soon.